Welcome back, everyone. And let me introduce our next guest, who's Dr. Abby Smith-Ryan from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. We're happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, hello, thank you. You all can see my screen, I believe. Well, I'm honored to be here on my spring break. Luckily, I get to talk about one of my most favorite topics, creatine. And I have the privilege of talking about creatine for women, and I can sum it up really quickly. I will add some more context, but my hope is that today you leave here with a little bit more evidence and confidence in why I believe all women should supplement with creatine. Before we dive in, I just want to give a shout out to my co-authors of this specific review that I will highlight today. One of my PhD students, Hannah, and then doctors Joan Eckerson and Darren Kandow. Darren speaks after me, and he is going to highlight more of the use in aging, and particularly, I'm assuming he'll highlight some postmenopausal women, but I will also briefly introduce that today. So let's dive in. I do have some conflicts of interest, but really I just have the privilege of studying some ingredients, creatine being one of them. It won't impact anything that I share with you today. So in our review, I'm not going to go through it verbatim, obviously you all can read, but I do want to highlight, and the goal for me today is to allow you all to think about maybe some different applications for creatine in women, particularly in different phases of the lifespan. My hope is that we all leave here today with a better understanding of why creatine supplementation might be helpful in women, particularly through different phases of the lifestyle as estrogen and progesterone change, but then also to develop new research ideas. And I'm also very fortunate to share some brand new research results from a neat study from our lab that we just analyzed last week. And so giving a little bit of insight into some different aspects of creatine use in female physiology. So I thought it would be really helpful. We have these amazing few days that talk about various applications of creatine supplementation. But I wanted to target really what are potential mechanisms that would be particularly helpful for women. I'm going to dive into this a little bit more by explaining some specific female physiology components, but on a high level, some things to think about as we start thinking about the use of creatine in women. There's some data that is suggesting that women may have a greater anabolic resistance as they age. There's differences potentially in protein kinetics across the menstrual cycle. So the fact that creatine may support muscle protein kinetics, particularly at the satellite cell level, leads some potential use not only for healthy menstruating women, but particularly different aspects of the menstrual cycle. And then to me, even realizing that as women age, it may be even more helpful. A metabolic buffer, glycogen regulation, two aspects that are highlighted in female physiology. Specifically, there's some various phases of the cycle where buffering or performance may be altered, which I'll touch on here in a second. And there's some specific relation to glycogen use and uptake and even storage across the menstrual cycle. There's some mechanisms with creatine relating to calcium handling, but then also oxidative stress and inflammation. The latter also impacted potentially with female physiology. So let's jump in and just giving you my perspective based on evidence of some key targets for why creatine might be helpful, and then also some evidence of where it has been particularly looked at in women. So when we look at female physiology, just wanted to highlight here what happens or some kind of aspects throughout the life cycle of a female. When we think about reproductive age and pre-menopause, we're really talking about any time from puberty onto irregular menstrual cycles or perimenopause. And that's really onset of perimenopause is about the age of 41 or 42. During that time of reproductive age, there's a cyclical factor of estrogen and progesterone and FSH levels, not all the same and very much influenced by hormonal contraception. But we do have some differences, kind of early cycle, late cycle. I'll talk about that here in a second. What I wanted to highlight in this transition here, the perimenopause and postmenopause, is where estrogen declines and where we see a lot of changes in the muscle for women, which I'll highlight. But I think where we need more research, but also a high level of potential for creatine supplementation in women as they transition into menopause. When we look at the majority of the literature and where we would think about use of creatine, particularly in our active women, and where the potential might happen for females throughout a menstrual cycle. Not all women have a normal 28-day cycle, and the literature suggests that more than 60% of women are on a hormonal contraception. I think that's a huge area of research that my lab is trying to tackle, but also that we need with creatine. How does creatine and something like a birth control impact its effects? When we look at a non-hormonal contraceptive group or just a eumenoric cycle, we see what I've highlighted here in this orange line is our creatine kinase levels. Creatine kinase changes throughout the menstrual cycle. And a couple key points here: the beginning of the cycle is when we have menstruation or bleeding, and the latter is the luteal phase where we see higher levels of estrogen. During those phases, we also see some metabolic changes that could potentially be impacted by creatine. So this was from a review paper that we wrote regarding nutrition components with women. And I wanted to bring it up as a way to start thinking. There's a lot of more research that needs to be done, but based on what we do know physiologically and mechanistically from creatine, a couple of things to think about. When we look at the luteal phase, which is that latter half of the cycle, when estrogen levels are high, also oftentimes when premenstrual cycle symptoms happen, we also see an increase in protein oxidation and potentially protein needs. This could be a potential spot where creatine could help some of those protein kinetics. Also in that phase, that luteal phase, we see a reduced effectiveness of carbohydrate loading, particularly related to some carbohydrate oxidation. So thinking about the potential of creatine in the luteal phase and with or without carbohydrate may help with carbohydrate oxidation as we think about something particularly carbohydrate or creatine monohydrate, bringing carbohydrate and water into the cell. Data suggests that in the luteal phase, fatigue is also greater, potentially impacting performance, but also perception of fatigue. And so if we think about the nitty-gritty effects of creatine in pure phosphocreatine turnover and ATP production, potentially better performance effects in the luteal phase when we are looking at creatine. And then on the front end of the cycle, during something like the menstrual phase or the menses, there seems to be greater inflammation and oxidative stress in that follicular phase. So then what about, is there potential in the follicular phase? The interesting thing with creatine is that you wouldn't necessarily only supplement during one phase because you've saturated the muscle, but just really thinking about when we look at the implications of creatine, I would hypothesize that the best effects would potentially be seen in the luteal phase based on some of these physiological differences. However, planting some seeds to think about. There's some data that suggests sleep cycles change over the menstrual cycle. Some data suggests like right as menstruation starts, sleep is more poor. But also during that luteal phase, right before menstruation starts, the hormones are changing, PMS symptoms are higher. And so then thinking, what happens when women are sleep deprived or sleeping is less? then we start to think about cognitive effects, anxiety and depression, kind of implications of our cognition. So other applications of creatine that can be explored while also understanding which phase might it be more appropriate in, and then realizing that this is not only applied or this is for a normal menstrual cycle. So let's get into some of the data. One thing I wanted to highlight, and this was highlighted yesterday, I thought very nicely, and the idea that the majority of creatine users are in men. And this is a review paper that we put together several years ago, describing the effects on hydration and indirectly on body weight. And when we think about, one of the benefits I've always said about creatine is the positive effects on hydration. It brings water into the cell and can be very effective to prevent dehydration. Which is majority has been evaluated in men. When we look at some of the data in a menstrual cycle and hydration and temperature regulation, we see that during the luteal phase, that latter half, again, that higher hormone phase, is where we see some effects on potential higher body temperature, poor temperature regulation, but we also see sometimes greater fluid retention and higher body weight in that luteal phase. So one of the main reasons women don't consume creatine is this fear for weight gain. To date, really, the literature has suggested that for many reasons, men are really the group that see an increase in body weight from creatine loading. And really, it hasn't been reported in women. But could it be because of dosing? Could it be because of the menstrual cycle that really hasn't been controlled for? Or do women just respond differently based on our baseline levels of creatine? So I'm going to present some of that data in a little bit. Looking specifically at hydration and that idea of, could creatine be particularly helpful for hydration in women? A shout out goes to Sam Moore, one of my PhD students, who we just analyzed some of this data, looking at the impact of creatine on the menstrual cycle and hydration, and looking at creatine versus a placebo. And essentially what we did was allow for women to be tested during the follicular phase of their cycle and the luteal phase of their cycle in randomized order in a double-blind placebo-controlled crossover design, and then evaluated them with placebo or creatine. And high-level outcomes we thought were very fascinating and really supports the literature in men, but pretty interesting when we think about the application for women across the menstrual cycle. What we identified was that total body water was significantly improved or increased in the creatine group in the luteal phase. Extracellular fluid was increased in the creatine group in the luteal phase. And intracellular fluid was also increased in the creatine group in the luteal phase. This was not significant, but you can see that shift. So one takeaway here is that hydration may be improved and thermoregulation may be improved, particularly in the luteal phase when some of that is suppressed with creatine supplementation. After looking at this, the question should be, well, how does this impact body water? And how does this impact body weight? Would it potentially increase weight since we're seeing these fluid shifts? Another application would be if you have a female that potentially is trying to make weight or weight, worried about some of those fluid changes, recognizing that fluid may be more effective in the luteal phase. We saw no impact on the follicular phase or that low hormone phase. This is just some individual responses demonstrating that nearly all of the groups in the creatine group saw those similar fluid trends, which is in this square box for the creatine. So then what about body mass? So it really consistent, like I mentioned, that body mass doesn't tend to change for females, but to date, we really haven't explored that kind of synergistic effect across the menstrual cycle. And what we demonstrated here in the follicular phase, there was a slight decrease in weight for the creatine group, really no significant change in weight for the follicular. And this also wasn't a significant change in the luteal phase for the creatine group. You're seeing about a 0.5 pound increase. So this idea that creatine loading in women may cause weight gain, It actually doesn't cause total body weight gain, but it does act to potentially improve fluid shifts, which I think is a positive. It may help with thermoregulation. So one, throwing out some research potential, looking at creatine supplementation, particularly with and without carbohydrate across that luteal phase. It will be really interesting to evaluate the impact of creatine on potential thermoregulation, glycogen supercompensation, and those indirect then performance effects for these women. This was a foundational paper by one of the co-authors on the review, Dr. Joan Eckerson, and a huge mentor to me. It was published in 2016. So we took much of the data that was presented here. And this group really focused on the premenopausal group, higher level collegiate athletes, and looked at sport performance, which is great. And really the takeaway is that, creatine can support performance effects. However, many women that are maybe not premenopausal or collegiate athletes or concerned about sport performance can also benefit from creatine. So we expanded some of the literature to really look at, what happens to weight gain, what happens beyond strength and power and anaerobic performance, and how do we apply that to women that are also just trying to be healthy, and all the other aspects related to some of our cognition and differences between men and women. So I'm going to present some of the findings from our paper, and I wanted to describe it a little. This is one of my favorite ways to talk about some reviews and applications of synthesizing the literature using relative effects. And really what we're allowed to do is to take our creatine effects and our placebo effects and compare them. And how does creatine affect some of these outcomes? And for strength performance in primarily premenopausal women, there's a couple different groups here. Picture says 1,000 words. When we look at the data on strength performance of creatine in women, any value over 100 shows an improvement in strength performance. So when you look at these outcomes of upper body strength primarily, or kind of peak power strength, you're seeing a consistent improvement in strength performance for women. It's pretty hard to refute. Here we're seeing more fatigue outcomes. So looking at some of these outcomes, we're looking at things like anaerobic working capacity, or a threshold at which we can train above for our kind of anaerobic improvements. A couple of the studies of our early work with my mentor, Dr. Stout, is looking at a fatigue threshold. So if we're able to delay fatigue in different groups, does that allow for greater training volume? One of these studies here by Dr. Stout was in older women. So training above a fatigue threshold or improving fatigue could be directly related to health and quality of life. You're seeing the same trend here, that really essentially all of the studies in women have shown a positive effect by delaying fatigue, allowing them to exercise or function at a higher level with just supplementation. My group wanted to also evaluate not only exercise performance, what happens across the menstrual cycle, but then also recovery. That's still a big question that I think is potential or has potential for creatine, is not only how does it influence performance directly, but is there any impact on recovery from exercise based on some of those blood flow differences and vasodilation and buffering capacity that may differ between men and women. So this is another study or another results outcome from our study conducted by one of my master's students, Amanda Gordon, really looking at heart rate variability as some recovery outcomes, and an anaerobic kind of repeated sprint ability test, 10 by 6 second sprints. Again, kind of early follicular and compared to luteal phase with or without creatine in a crossover design. A couple outcomes to share. So there was a significant improvement in what we call fatigue index for the creatine group in the luteal phase. Oftentimes performance, we see greater decreases in performance in the luteal phase, and it appears that maybe there's an impact of creatine in delaying fatigue or improving fatigue in that luteal phase, where there's no difference in the follicular phase. On some of the peak power outcome, you can see there was no differences in peak power between the two groups. However, there tended to be a potential difference in that luteal phase again. There were no differences in recovery from heart rate variability. So some takeaway here to think about is that if we are studying creatine in women and we haven't controlled for the menstrual cycle, or we are looking in the follicular phase, we may not see as much of an effect. Or if you're a woman and you're exercising, we may see better advantages of creatine supplementation for performance in the luteal phase, which is the latter half, kind of the high hormone phase. Thinking about application for sport performance, this is from our review, looking at some of those more kind of sprint times, 100-meter dash, 400-meter sprints. You can see really that same trend with that increase in performance. Really highlighting, hopefully you're seeing that the trend is there and really the data is consistent that creatine supplementation will increase performance. And really identifying that it may even be more advantageous for those times where we see decrements in performance, which would be in the luteal phase. So when we look at the summary for kind of that premenopausal or really application to sport, most of these studies used a creatine loading dose. And a question came up yesterday of, should the supplementation recommendations be the same for women as they are for men? And I would say yes, generally, that a loading phase would be the same, and we would recommend that. Some things to start to think about in the literature and even application would be, are there more optimal times to load? Would it be more optimal to load right after ovulation so that the muscle is fully saturated during the luteal phase? Another option to think about is just daily creatine intake, a daily 5-gram dose based on some of its effects I'll talk about here in a second, related to some of the cognitive effects that are maybe more attributable to women. The other thing to think about is a lot of these studies have looked at just supplementation, and it's very rare to find a supplement that works without exercise. And it appears that creatine does, and it may, if you combine it with training, we often see better effects. And I would argue we see that those better effects when we're thinking about some outcomes of bone and muscle, which become more important when we think about our peri and postmenopausal women. So yes, the supplementation should be the same, but I think it will be interesting to start to identify, will it be impacted, or should we consider menstrual cycle phase and potentially even contraception, oral contraception, and the impact that it may have on the outcomes of creatine. We saw a great presentation yesterday by Dr. Ellery. I just wanted to highlight, as part of a life cycle of a female, if pregnancy is involved, you don't have to stop creatine supplementation. And as a mom of 2, I would argue it's better to keep it and potentially increase your dose. She did an amazing job talking about the metabolic changes that happen with pregnancy. And that there's even potential prophylactic use by supplementing as a mother and even nursing for the fetus. Something to think about too is just the application, the mental component that happens during pregnancy and postpartum related to depression and anxiety. And there's some research I'll highlight here too that creatine supplementation may support that. A lot of times we think about, well, I'll say take creatine during pregnancy, but don't tell your doctor. And I say that not to go against your doctor, but because it's hard to describe why you would take creatine as a female. But the research really supports there is very minimal risk and really only potential benefit, not only for you as the mother based on metabolic changes, but also for the child. Now rolling into kind of this idea of post-menopause or peri to post-menopause. Dr. Kandau, I'm sure will highlight some of this, but I wanted to summarize it briefly. There is data that suggests that creatine could support greater bone mineral density. This paper here is a review that highlights improved femoral neck BMD, where there wasn't a lot of other effects on total body bone mineral density, but by itself of creatine alone. But if you combine creatine with resistance training in some of these older women is where you see a bigger effect. And this would be exacerbated, I think, in this group, particularly with lower protein intakes that was kind of mentioned yesterday. Another component here is looking at strength in these women. So when combining creatine supplementation and some training in older women, there's significant improvements in strength, which has many applications to health and quality of life. And then lastly, when combined with some training, we're seeing greater increases in fat-free mass from a creatine group. So by a small amount of creatine with some training, there's significant effects on bone and muscle and strength in these older women, or more of a, kind of depending on our estrogen levels. And so then I wanted to highlight kind of the potential application of that transition to menopause. So this is not a study in creatine, but it's a paper that we've explored, really trying to identify and have identified that perimenopause, which is that, anywhere from 4 to 8 years of the transition right before menopause, where a number of physiological changes are occurring to bone and muscle and metabolism. Particularly, we're seeing that there's a significant decrease in protein, whole body protein turnover in that transition to perimenopause, as well as muscle mass and metabolism, and really highlighting their significant composition changes and an increase in menopausal symptoms. And so I wanted to share this really as this idea of, if we are going to recommend creatine to females, one of the key time points would be perimenopause. Not only is it a window of opportunity for lifelong health, but it also may have significant impacts on bone. And we also identify that perimenopause is really that key turning point for a number of metabolic and mental health changes related to menopausal symptoms. So if you're looking to study creatine in women, this would be a key opportunity. And then just a couple other ideas. So the female brain is very different than the male brain. I don't know if you guys knew that, but I'll give you some data so it's not me just talking. 1 in 8 women experience more depression in their lifetime. It's twice the rate as men. That's significantly increased in perimenopause and very high prevalence postpartum. Women report more worry and cognitive variables associated worry with men. And so we're thinking about that cognitive connection. Dr. Rawson is going to talk about that later today, but just wanted you to introduce this concept in women. Women have higher rates of depression. And like I mentioned, it does seem to uptick in that perimenopause. And thinking about some of the altered brain bioenergetics that are linked with depression, it's very much related to creatine kinase and some of those bioenergetics that we see with creatine. We also identify creatine supplementation supports increases in frontal lobe phosphocreatine levels. Women have reported to have lower creatine levels in the brain. And so is there a connection with creatine supplementation and brain, particularly in women? The research suggests yes, and I know Dr. Rawson will tell us more about that later. A couple things I wanted to just share is that after creatine supplementation in women, there is a significant increase in frontal lobe creatine levels, and that has been associated with greater changes in kind of feelings of depression or a reduction in depression. When combined with antidepressant use, there's even a potential better effect. So combining creatine or creatine supplementation in women that are already on some sort of SSRI. And then lastly, memory. Oops. So I wanted to think about our application. Vegetarianism came up yesterday, and we often see a better effect in those individuals. But in a feeling or scenario when memory is reduced, creatine supplementation tends to improve memory. And I want to bring that up because if we think about what I've already introduced, this concept of sleep, changes in memory and cognition and depression as women age, there may be even more potential and exploration of the effect of creatine for women as they start to deal with some of these memory changes. One key time point, again, being postpartum with that mom brain or fog. I can tell you it's very real, and creatine can be very effective in my experience, as well as some of the literature. Lastly, I want to introduce this idea of cognition and sleep, which I know we'll dive in later in a little bit more depth, but wanted to put this layer of females. So it goes back to this idea that any brain activity results in a reduction of phosphocreatine to help maintain ATP. And so under periods of, greater cognition and memory and attention, under sleep deprivation, that demand for ATP is elevated. So thinking about some of the things that we know about women, there's strong data that suggests that women multitask more. We survive more on less sleep, whether that be because of child rearing or whatever it may be. So then we think about the layer of the menstrual cycle and sleep disturbances there. I think there's application for women with creatine supplementation to support better memory related to how our brains work, as well as potential greater effects during sleep deprivation, which may happen during kind of perimenopause or even in the postpartum phase. And just wanted to highlight here, there's this is a great review and some good papers that I'm sure Dr. Rawson will talk about later, but really just highlighting that creatine may improve short-term memory and intelligent and reasoning. It's more effective under great periods of stress and aging. And so just again, thinking about those differences between males and females, women as they age may be particularly susceptible to improvements from creatine on some of these outcomes. And then just one last kind of highlight here is higher resting creatine levels in the brain are associated with greater neuropsychological performance. So just again, thinking about, I know as a working mom, I am usually sleep deprived and always multitasking. And I think that would be the perfect scenario to see better improvements with creatine supplementation. And then if you combine with lower protein levels or vegetarians, we tend to see even a greater effect. So to wrap up, a couple things to think about. These are the dosing recommendations that really aren't much different from a male. A couple of things to think about, like I mentioned, would be, a loading dose. Maybe consider the phase of the menstrual cycle. Think about evenly spacing them throughout the day. Or would a consistent daily dose be more effective? Now, it takes longer for the muscle and brain levels to be saturated, but it still gets you to the same effect. And then if the goal is brain saturation, so if we're trying to target that mental component, slightly higher doses would be helpful, but just recognizing you still want those divided doses. I still think that, some data across the menstrual cycle with contraception and even with aging, like could potentially a higher dose, like a 10-gram dose split divided, would that be more effective for women to help support anabolic resistance as they age? So to wrap up, a quick shout out to my team. A couple of my PhD students are here, and we just finished this amazing study of creatine and women across the menstrual cycle, which I think gives us even more question and application to what we might see with contraception and as women transition to the menopause. And you can find me here at these few places and this afternoon on the panel as well. So thank you to all of you for your attention.